So there's the 90s. After 9/11, and especially since the onset of the Iraq War, you have a massive resurrection, both of imperialism and the discourse, various discourses of imperialism, theories of empire, and anti-imperialist motifs. So in a sense, that critique of the kind of tunnel vision anti-imperialism that led many on the left to be deeply confused about the Balkans, if not in fact support forces of murderous reaction, that critique of the kind of tunnel vision anti-imperialism of the 1990s that confused many about the Balkans in some ways kind of lost ground given the resurrection of empire after 9/11 under the Bush administration and with the Iraq War. Think of titles of books like Rashid Khalidi's Resurrecting Empire, David Harvey's The New Imperialism, Tom Engelhardt, who does the daily e-journal TomDispatch.com for The Nation, edits an entire series of books called The American Empire Project, which includes Chomsky's Hegemony or Survival. We have become saturated with the discourse of empire, and with good reason, because we are, in fact, in a new era of global imperialism. So given this, it might appear to be the worst possible moment to, in a sense, resurrect part of the critique from the 1990s vis-a-vis the Balkans, part of the critique that some of us on the left began to make of tunnel vision anti-imperialism. This would seem to be the most anachronistic moment to suggest that the left in some ways is too focused on imperialism, when in fact the mainstream is not focused enough on imperialism. And yet that's exactly what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it very briefly by focusing on the situation in Iran today. Iran illuminates with extreme sharpness, if not blinding illumination, the limitations of imperialism as the organizing conceptual principle of left analysis. That kind of anti-imperialism can lead down a sort of cul-de-sac of myopia, a distorting mirror, I argue, which has the effect of holding up a sort of distorting mirror. Let me give you a concrete example. Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad uses the rhetoric of anti-imperialism not infrequently in his posturing on foreign policy in particular. This confuses a lot of people on the left. Some explicitly admire him. Most don't, but are a bit flummoxed and don't understand, especially when someone like Hugo Chavez embraces Ahmadinejad, not merely in the terms of realpolitik and the global political economy of oil, which are perfectly realistic, pragmatic ways in which Venezuela and Iran have common interests. That's a separate issue. I'm talking about Chavez's rhetorical embrace of Ahmadinejad as a, quote, revolutionary brother, okay? That is entirely gratuitous to the question of the realpolitik, pragmatic economic common front between Venezuela and Iran. There's no need, in other words, for Chavez, there's no objective need for Chavez to frame his solidarity with Ahmadinejad in revolutionary terms or in terms of solidarity. And yet he does, and this has a very confusing effect for a lot of people on the left. The bottom line is that, to cut a long story short, Ahmadinejad is on the far right of Iranian politics, not the left. He does not represent the forces in Iran with whom we, on the left, should be in solidarity. On the contrary, those in Iran with whom we should be in solidarity are feminists, workers, student radicals, dissident intellectuals, women's rights activists, and the like. I've written a book about this, which came out last month, called Reading Legitimation Crisis in Tehran, in which I outline this case in some detail. I think that one of the key reasons that the left fails to understand that Iranian context in broad terms is what I'll call the Chavez effect, the discourse of anti-imperialism that Ahmadinejad and Chavez use. Another one is that the emancipatory claims, and I'll just conclude on this, the emancipatory claims of Iranian dissidents tend not to be expressed in the idiom of anti-imperialism as much as they are in the language of human rights, women's rights, pluralism, secularism, freedom of expression, what many Marxists and anti-imperialists, in other words, not all, but many, tend to dismiss as, quote, bourgeois rights, as opposed to a radical agenda. But that is not a reason to fail to support them, I argue, which the bulk of the Western left has in fact failed to do, something that I take up in my book. The Iranian struggle is indeed an anti-imperialist struggle, even if it isn't principally or anti-imperialist to the exclusion of these other issues. The struggle in Iran today is twofold, as one of the Iranian student activists who shouted down Ahmadinejad a few weeks ago at Tehran University said, within a couple of days of Ahmadinejad accepting David Duke and embracing him at the Global Holocaust Conference. So think of that image, David Duke, an outright fascist, being embraced by Ahmadinejad, and student radicals at Tehran University denouncing Ahmadinejad and saying, our struggle is twofold. It's against external interference, imperialist powers, on the one hand, and it's against internal authoritarianism and repression on the other. I would like to argue that our struggle should also be twofold. It should be to struggle against U.S. imperialism and aggression against Iran, for example, to stop the U.S. from attacking Iran. But it should also be a struggle of solidarity with the emancipatory forces in Iran. Are we simply anti-imperialist, or are we pro-emancipation? Anti-imperialism, I argue, is necessary but not sufficient. It's half of the equation. It says what we're against, but what are we for?